When you think about human history, the way it's taught, it's usually this grand narrative of progress, right? It's a series of victories, achievements, these big technological leaps.
Exactly, a straight line pointing up.
But if you actually do a deep dive into the sources, I mean, the real stuff, the forensic evidence, the economic data, you find that the biggest, most fundamental changes to our world, to our human architecture, are written in something much, much darker.
That is so true. We love to focus on what we build, but so much of our history is actually shaped by what gets broken. Disasters, whether they come from nature or our own technological hubris, or, and this is the really disturbing one, from policy failure, they act like historical engines.
Historical engines, I like.
Yeah, they don't just destroy things, they're like a crucible. They heat society up so fast that all its hidden flaws, its weaknesses, its real priorities, they all just come boiling to the surface.
Yeah.
And it forces this immediate, profound evolution.
And that is exactly what we're setting out to do today. We have a whole stack of sources here focused on 4 massive catastrophes: Pompeii, the Titanic, the Black Death, and the Partition famines in South Asia.
4 very different events.
Totally different. And our mission is to move past just the tragedy of it all and really analyze how these specific moments became these catastrophic turning points, how they forced the institutional and psychological shifts that, literally created the world we're living in right now. It's almost like a shortcut to understanding what really drives historical change. Okay, let's unpack this. History does not repeat itself, but catastrophe always rhymes. The echoes from 79 CE are, in a weird way, still telling us how we should be managing risk today.
And that idea of rhyming is so critical. Catastrophe is like a universal language because the questions it forces us to ask are timeless. Who gets protected? Whose life is seen as expendable? Which laws actually hold up when things get really bad? So by looking at how the past dealt with these huge societal failures, we get this incredibly valuable insight into how we might handle the crises we're facing right now, whether that's a new pandemic or climate change or, major geopolitical conflict.
So let's start our journey with maybe the ultimate historical moment, the one that's basically captured in amber, or I guess in ash. Let's talk about Pompeii.
The quintessential disaster.
We all kind of know the basics. Mount Vesuvius erupts on August 24th, 79 CE. It just devastates the whole area. Maybe 16,000 people die. But the way it destroyed everything, that's what made it such a powerful historical engine. It wasn't just a slow lava flow.
No, not at all. And that's a really common misconception that frankly hides how terrifying the event really was. Vesuvius erupted in at least 8 different phases over something like 18 hours.
18 hours.
Yeah, the first part was ash and pumice stone just raining down for hours and hours. But the real destructive force, the thing that did the most damage, came later when the eruption column collapsed on itself and generated these superheated avalanches. They're called pyroclastic surges.
So we're not talking about molten rock. This is something else entirely.
Exactly. Forget lava. This is superheated gas and volcanic debris moving at hundreds of miles an hour.
Wow.
The cities, Pompeii and Herculaneum, they were buried in this stuff. We're talking temperatures that could get over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And that extreme thermal shock is what killed everyone instantly and created what we call the freeze frame effect.
And the sources are just incredible on what was preserved. It's this messy, vibrant slice of Roman life. You see these lavish, beautiful villas right next to these overcrowded apartment blocks.
The inequality is right there.
It's so stark. And there's graffiti, there are taverns, market stalls with food still on them. The level of detail is just unbelievable. But the most chilling thing, for me at least, has to be the graffiti someone found on a wall. It just says, "Nothing lasts forever."
The irony is just, it's breathtaking, isn't it? A casual comment about how life is fleeting and it gets frozen for eternity.
Yeah.
But to really get the disaster's impact, you have to look at the context of Roman belief. They lived under this idea of the Pax Diorum, the peace of the gods. The thinking was, as long as Rome was winning wars and was stable, the gods were happy.
So a totally random, incomprehensible disaster like Vesuvius must have just shaken that social contract with the gods to its very core.
It did, but it was a slow burn. If you dig into the lesser-known context, what you see is that the Pompeians were suffering from a profound case of risk blindness.
Risk blindness, what does that mean?
For years leading up to 79 CE, they had been dealing with frequent, pretty serious earthquakes. There was a huge one in 62 CE that did massive damage. But because earthquakes were just a common thing in that region, they normalized it.
You just got used to it.
Exactly. The warning signs became background noise. They put their trust in the status quo, this illusion of permanence, right up until the moment it disintegrated under a mile of ash.
So the danger wasn't that they didn't see the signs. The danger was that they saw them so often they just stopped paying attention.
It's the textbook definition of human complacency in the face of a danger that keeps escalating. But the long-term impact, that's where Pompeii really becomes this engine of history. The city was basically lost, and then it was rediscovered, first by accident, but then systematically starting in 1748.
That's a huge gap in time. Why is that 18th century rediscovery so important?
Well, the timing was perfect. It happened right as the European Enlightenment was morphing into Romanticism. The excavation basically created the modern science of archaeology.
How so?
Before Pompeii, history was mostly a story you read in a book, a narrative written by and about the elites, emperors, generals, But suddenly, with these plaster casts of ordinary people, with the preserved food and the graffiti, history became this visceral, democratic, emotional thing you could almost touch.
It wasn't just reading Tacitus anymore. You could see the baker, the slave, the soldier. It created a real tactile connection to the past.
Precisely. And it just captured the imagination of Western Europe. It was a huge driver of the Grand Tour for wealthy young men. It sparked this massive classical revival in art and architecture, the site of a perfectly preserved dead civilization. It inspired people like Goethe and Shelley. It reinforced that idea of memento mori, the reminder that we all die, but it was also this tangible warning about how fragile human achievement really is.
Okay, but one of the sources claims it taught them lessons about urban planning. Now, that feels like a bit of a stretch. I mean, the city was rediscovered during the Enlightenment. They were busy with huge social and intellectual changes. Was anyone really looking at Roman street grids for policy ideas?
That's a fair challenge. It wasn't like they issued immediate policy directives based on Pompeii. It was more about providing foundational insights into, say, urban resilience and public health.
It's more of a comparison point.
Exactly. When those 18th century excavators walked through Pompeii, they saw these incredibly advanced street structures, complex water management, a kind of integrated sanitation that was, frankly, cleaner and better organized than London or Paris at the time.
Huh.
It wasn't a direct lesson, but it showed architects and engineers what was possible in terms of planning. It influenced the development of grid systems and better drainage in the centuries that followed. It was proof that an organized city needs systems that can actually withstand a shock.
Okay, that makes more sense. So if Pompeii's lesson was about how vulnerable the ancient world was to nature, then the sinking of the Titanic in April 1912, that was a brutal lesson about how vulnerable the modern world is to its own arrogance.
Oh, absolutely. The Titanic was so much more than just a ship. It was this powerful symbol of what they called the Gilded Age mythos. This was that moment, right before World War I, where Western confidence and technology was just absolute.
The belief that we could build our way out of any problem.
Exactly. The belief that human engineering, big money, and industrial scale had finally conquered nature and risk.
And that whole unsinkable line wasn't just a marketing slogan, it became a fatal flaw.
It really was. The loss of around 1,500 lives on its very first voyage was the catastrophic failure of that entire worldview. And the sources are crystal clear on this. It wasn't just an accident, it was a devastating systemic failure caused by arrogance and negligence just piled on top of each other.
So let's break that down. What were the specific systemic flaws that the sinking just ripped open for everyone to see?
Well, first and foremost, the most basic safety failure, the lifeboats. The Titanic was built with lifeboat capacity for only 11,178 people.
And there were over 2,200 people on board.
Over 2,200. Now, technically, this met the outdated British Board of Trade regulations at the time, but it was a practical absurdity, and it was driven entirely by this belief that the ship would never sink and the boats would only ever be needed to, ferry people to a rescue ship.
So they were compliant with the letter of the law, but they completely failed the test of reality.
Catastrophically. And then you have the way it revealed these deep societal fractures. The survival rates were just brutally stratified by class. First-class women had a nearly 97% survival rate.
97%.
Meanwhile, third-class men, only about 15% survived. And crucially, we have multiple eyewitness accounts confirming that third-class passengers were often physically blocked or even locked below decks, which made it almost impossible for them to get to the lifeboats.
So the ship was literally a microcosm of Edwardian society, and when the crisis hit, those class barriers didn't just hold, they became deadly.
They became death sentences. And it completely refutes that romantic myth of orderly heroism, the whole women and children first ideal.
Right, one of our sources, the historian Stephen Beale, he talks about this clash of narratives.
He does. He identifies this fight between the conservative narrative, which focuses on heroism and order, and the radical narrative, which is all about class and justice. And the truth is, while there was undeniable heroism, the reality is much, much closer to that radical narrative of class-based chaos.
And the failures just keep coming. What about the communication, the radio messages?
Another systemic failure, the commercial telegram traffic, messages about stock prices, dinner reservations for wealthy passengers, that was being prioritized. It totally overloaded the airwaves.
So they were sending personal telegrams instead of listening for warnings.
Essentially, yes. Repeated urgent ice warnings from other ships nearby were either missed or just dismissed by operators who were too busy with the commercial traffic. It's the ultimate example of prioritizing profit and convenience over safety and human life. It created a disaster that was, at least in its scale, totally avoidable.
What makes the Titanic such a potent historical engine, though, is that it forced this immediate global legislative response that almost never happens after a single event.
It's incredibly rare. Just months after the sinking, it drove the creation of the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea. We call it SOLAS.
And SOLAS is the treaty that still governs global maritime safety today. That direct line from one tragedy in 1912 to our standards right now is just incredible.
It is. And SOLAS mandated things that seem completely obvious to us now, but were revolutionary then. First, mandatory lifeboat capacity for every single person on board a vessel. No exceptions.
A simple but vital change.
Second, it required 24-hour radio watches on all passenger ships. That ensured that distress calls would never be missed again because an operator was asleep or busy. And third, it established the International Ice Patrol to monitor icebergs in the North Atlantic. These changes didn't just tweak the rules, they completely rewired the entire global consciousness around shipping safety. The arrogance of that industrial hubris was finally checked by international law.
So we've gone from the sudden thermal destruction of Pompeii to the swift mechanical failure of the Titanic. Now we jump centuries to a catastrophe on a totally different scale. The biological apocalypse of the Black Death.
Yes. The Black Death, or the Great Pestilence, as they called it, was a series of outbreaks from the bacterium Yersinia pestis, and it fundamentally broke the medieval world. It was an early and frankly terrifying consequence of globalization. It traveled along the Silk Road and other trade routes.
And the scale of it. I mean, the loss of life is what makes this event just so different from the others. It's almost impossible to really wrap your head around it.
It truly is. The most conservative estimates suggest it killed 30 to 50% of Europe's entire population in just 5 years.
30 to 50%.
But more recent demographic studies, they suggest the mortality rate might have been closer to 60% in some regions. Entire towns, hundreds of villages were just wiped off the map. They're now what archaeologists in England call lost villages. It was a demographic collapse that has no parallel in European history.
And the sources really emphasize this point. While the death itself was indiscriminate, it hit peasants and princes, the aftermath was the complete opposite. It created this incredible labor shortage.
And that's the absolute crux of the Black Death as a historical engine. The scarcity of labor suddenly and completely shifted the economic balance of power. It shifted from the landowners, the aristocracy, to the surviving peasants. The whole feudal manorial system, which had defined society for centuries, it relied on a huge captive labor force that was tied to the land serfdom.
So when half the serfs die, the ones who are left suddenly find themselves in this position they've never been in before. They can demand wages, better working conditions, even freedom to move.
Exactly. The old social order was just smashed. In England in 1351, the elites passed something called the Statute of Laborers, which was this desperate attempt to freeze wages at pre-plague levels.
How did that work out?
It was a complete failure. Economic reality just trumped legislation. Landowners were forced to offer tenancy and actual wages just to keep their estates from falling apart. And this accelerated the decline of feudalism by maybe 100 years. It empowered the surviving peasantry, and it really seeded the rise of an independent, economically viable middle class.
That's just a powerful example of how a crisis can redistribute power just through market forces. When your labor becomes the scarce resource, You, the laborer, you win.
And sociologically, the response was just chaotic. It was fractured. You saw these extreme psychological reactions. On one hand, you had intense piety, like the self-flagellant movements, these groups of people who would travel from town to town, whipping themselves to atone for humanity's sins because they believed the plague was a divine punishment.
And on the other end,
Total hedonism, a kind of carpe diem mentality, a sense that, death could come at any moment, so you should live for today. And tragically, this chaos also led to horrific scapegoating. There were widespread pogroms against Jewish communities who were falsely accused of poisoning wells.
But amidst all that fear and chaos, there was something else emerging, right? A more rational response. The very first stirrings of public health.
Yes, that's the innovation that was forged in the fire. Faced with this terrifying invisible killer, some of the Mediterranean cities started to implement early administrative measures. The sources often point to the Venetian system.
What did they do?
They required ships arriving from ports that had the plague to anchor outside the harbor for a certain number of days. At first, it was 30 days, a trentina, but eventually they extended it to 40 days, the quarantina giorni.
And that's where we get our word quarantine.
That's exactly where it comes from. It showed this shift, however small, toward applying administrative reason and isolation to a biological threat, instead of just relying on prayer. And the long-term shift from all this was profound. The church, which was the ultimate source of authority, it failed to stop the plague. That inability just shattered people's blind faith in the divine order, and it prepared the psychological ground for the Renaissance, the Reformation, and this long-term turn towards secular scientific inquiry. It fundamentally changed Europe's entire intellectual path.
Okay, so we've covered natural, technological, and biological catastrophes. We now have to turn to what is maybe the most disturbing category of all, the purely man-made catastrophe. And our sources classify the partition famines of South Asia as a human-engineered catastrophe.
This one is absolutely essential for understanding the architecture of modern geopolitical risk. The 1947 partition of India, where colonial administrators just arbitrarily drew lines on a map to create India and Pakistan, it resulted in this brutal, unbelievably rapid cataclysm.
The numbers are staggering. Something like 15 million people displaced, fleeing across these new borders, and maybe 1 million people died in the violence and chaos that followed.
And what's just shocking is that the sources confirm the man who drew the lines, a British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe, he had never even been to India before he was given this job.
That's unbelievable.
It just underscores the monumental indifference and the staggering administrative negligence of the colonial power in its final act. But to really understand the depth of this trauma, we have to rewind just a few years to the Bengal famine of 1943-44.
Which was a kind of devastating preview of how colonial policy would function under pressure.
Exactly. It resulted in an estimated 3 million deaths. And what's critical to understand here is that the Bengal famine was not caused by a single crop failure or a drought. That's the myth that's often been pushed.
So what was the real cause?
It was a famine of policy. The sources identify 2 key policies that were enforced by Winston Churchill's war cabinet during World War II. First, there was this relentless prioritization of stockpiling food for British troops and for European allies, often diverting grain that could have gone to India. And second, and this was maybe the most ruthless part, they implemented something called a denial policy in Bengal.
What did the denial policy actually entail?
It was a military strategy. It was designed to hinder a potential Japanese invasion by creating a scorched earth zone. This involved confiscating and in some cases burning massive stocks of rice. And critically, they seized over 60,000 boats.
Boats. Why boats?
Because in the river delta of Bengal, boats were the essential transport network. They were how rice got distributed. They were how farmers made their living. So they destroyed the means by which food could be moved and the means by which people could earn money to buy it.
So food became completely unattainable for millions of people, even if there wasn't a total crop failure in the region.
Precisely. Churchill famously refused to divert food aid, despite repeated pleas from officials in India. And that led to those estimated 3 million preventable deaths. The administrative collapse was just total. While people were starving in the streets, you had trains arriving full of displaced people that would then return empty. It proved that logistics and political will, not an absolute shortage of food, were the real executioners. It was policy-driven starvation.
And the long-term historical shift from this one event is just immense. It's still playing out today.
It is. It cemented permanent hostility between India and Pakistan, leading to massive defense spending on both sides. It created this deep collective trauma of betrayal and embedded this intergenerational distrust of foreign powers. And most profoundly, this experience convinced the newly independent India that the state had a moral duty to ensure its own food security above all else. This directly influenced India's current policy of holding massive grain stockpiles and its extensive farm subsidies. It's all designed to prevent a repeat of 1943.
So we've laid out the immediate structural changes from these four events.
Yeah.
But now we have to talk about the human residue, right? The psychological scar that gets woven into the cultural fabric of a nation and shapes it for generations.
Right. If we connect this to the bigger picture, what's so fascinating is how these immediate shocks become part of a society's collective DNA. They permanently change how people relate to trust and to authority. And this is where the work of the psychologist Kai Erikson becomes really essential.
One of the sources brought him up. How does he separate this idea of collective trauma, like what you'd see after the Black Death, from something like individual PTSD?
It's a key distinction. Individual PTSD is a wound to the individual psyche. It's about a loss of personal safety and control. Collective trauma, as Erikson defines it, is a wound to the social fabric itself.
So it's not just a bunch of individuals being traumatized. The whole community is wounded.
The entire community loses trust in its institutions. It's the collapse of shared meaning, the collapse of the belief that society will protect you.
And there's this observable pattern, right? First you get this disaster unity, everyone pulling together, but that's almost always followed by blame, by myth-making, and these big shifts in identity.
Always.
So let's walk through how that collective trauma actually played out in our 4 case studies.
Okay, starting with Pompeii. The psychological scar there was the birth of memento mori, this universal, very concrete reminder of how sudden death can be and how fragile everything we build is. But sociologically, its rediscovery transformed history into a democratic experience.
How so democratic?
When that 18th century visitor saw the casts of the poor, the slaves, the bakers, they were forced to see the shared vulnerability of the Roman everyman. It wasn't just about emperors anymore. It democratized classical history.
And the Titanic feels like it was the ultimate psychological crisis of trust for the early 20th century.
Absolutely. The trauma was rooted in the failure of the 3 pillars of modern confidence: technology, the unsinkable ship; science, the shoddy rivets; and authority, the white star line. When survival rates favored first-class men over third-class children, it inflicted this profound collective wound. The people in charge had failed their most basic moral duty.
And yet the sources point out this incredible push to create a heroic narrative almost immediately, the band playing on, all of that. Why was that mythologizing so important?
Because the trauma was so deep, the social fabric needed to be repaired right away, emphasizing the band playing, the captain going down with the ship, the women and children first idea. It was a kind of necessary cultural lie. Well, it was designed to restore faith in the inherent nobility of Western civilization and its leaders, even as the forensic evidence was revealing this chaotic, class-based struggle for survival. The mythology was a psychic band-aid.
The Black Death, though, seems like it had a much more transformative psychological impact. It went way beyond just making up myths.
Oh, it dismantled the entire feudal mindset. I mean, think about it. If the church, the ultimate source of meaning and comfort, couldn't protect you from the plague, then what power did it really hold?
It undermines everything.
Everything. The psychological shift was away from blind faith and passive acceptance of your fate. It drove this long-term intellectual turn towards secular, human-centered thinking. That trauma prepared the ground for the intellectual freedom of the Renaissance. And it empowered the living. Once you've survived an apocalypse, the threat of being evicted by your lord just seems a lot less terrifying. It gave the peasantry the confidence to demand their rights.
And finally, the Partition famines, that collective trauma of betrayal.
This is maybe the deepest scar of all, because it wasn't inflicted by nature or by accident. It was inflicted by the cynical political calculus of the ruling power. The psychological wound is one of deep-seated betrayal and colonial neglect. It was proof that colonial subjects were seen as expendable.
And that trauma is just woven into the DNA of modern India and Bangladesh.
Intrinsically, the tragedy is captured so perfectly in that chilling detail from the sources. The partition refugees who carried the keys to houses they would never use again. It's this symbol of a permanent forced detachment, a permanent scar of being abandoned by the state.
It's powerful how different cultures use these stories. The sources highlight that, the cultural variations in how we remember.
Yeah, it's stark. In the West, especially after something like the Titanic or even 9/11, the focus is often on heroism and a narrative of resetting, which leads to quick institutional reform. In Europe, the memory often gets institutionalized, museums, laws, monuments.
But not in South Asia.
In South Asia, the memory of partition and the Bengal famine is often characterized by silence, by suppression, by this intergenerational trauma that's too painful and too politically charged to really process openly. It's a political wound and a cornerstone of anti-colonial identity. The difference between a disaster that's used for national inspiration and one that defines a national tragedy is it's night and day.
Okay, so we've established the major historical lessons. But a deep dive isn't complete unless we challenge the comfortable stories. So here's where it gets really interesting. We're going to go beyond the textbook myths and find the harder forensic realities that often show us even deeper systemic problems.
And that forensic analysis is so important because the immediate, compelling story of a disaster is often simplified for us. And that simplification can hide the multiple, layered failures that actually led to the mass death.
Let's start with Pompeii. The common myth is that people died slowly, suffocating under all that ash. But what does the new forensic reality tell us about how they actually died?
The forensic truth, which we've learned from modern volcanology and analyzing the remains, is far more instantaneous and, frankly, gruesome. Now, some people did suffocate in that initial ashfall, but the vast majority of victims, especially those in the city, were killed by extreme thermal shock during the pyroclastic surges.
Thermal shock.
Yeah, when gas and ash that's over 700, maybe even 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit hits a human body, it causes immediate and horrific effects.
Like what kind of effects?
The heat was so intense it caused instant vaporization of soft tissue. And most gruesomely, it caused this rapid contraction of muscles and rapid boiling of body fluids, which is what explains the contorted postures we see in the casts and the fractures found in the bones. It wasn't a slow burial, it was instant annihilation by heat. The city became an oven in a split second.
And then there's the controversy around the city's rediscovery, which tells us a lot about the biases of the people doing the digging, the famous erotic art.
Right. Pompeii was a vibrant, messy, multicultural Roman port city. It was full of graffiti, brothels, and very explicit art, which just reflected the common Roman attitude towards sexuality. But when the city was being systematically excavated by elite Europeans in the 18th and 19th centuries, all of this erotic art clashed violently with their rigid Victorian morality.
So what did they do with it?
For nearly a century and a half, the most explicit artifacts were hidden away in a place called the Secret Cabinet, and you could only see them if you were an approved scholar.
That's a classic case of present judging the past. They were distorting history to make it more palatable for themselves.
Exactly. It shows how the narrative of a disaster can be hijacked and censored to fit the moral expectations of the day. They turned a complex, real port city into a sanitized, classical ruin.
Okay, let's move to the Titanic. The myth is so clean. A swift, unavoidable collision with an iceberg sank the unsinkable ship.
It's a clean, dramatic story. But the forensic analysis suggests the disaster was compounded by catastrophic engineering failures. These failures turned what should have been a damaging collision into an outright catastrophe. New evidence, including metallurgical analysis of salvaged pieces of the hull, points to the use of substandard rivets in certain sections.
Substandard in what way?
They were made of puddled iron instead of the higher quality steel used in the rest of the ship. This iron had a high concentration of slag, which made the rivets very brittle, especially in the near-freezing water of the North Atlantic. So when the iceberg grazed the hull, these brittle rivets just popped and sheared off, allowing water to rush in between the seams of the steel plates. The plates themselves weren't sliced open.
So the ship didn't fail because of the big steel plates. It failed because of the tiny little connectors holding them together.
A critical systemic vulnerability. And on top of that, there's the element of human negligence before the ship even sailed. There was a long-burning fire in one of the coal bunkers. Yeah, it had been smoldering for weeks, possibly warping or weakening the steel plates in the exact area of the hull that was then struck by the iceberg. The Titanic was structurally compromised before it even left the shipyard.
And the communication problem with the nearby ship, the SS California, is more complex than just one guy being negligent too.
Much more complex. The myth paints the California as just willfully ignoring the distress calls. The reality is that their radio operator, Cyril Evans, had shut down his radio for the night, which was standard procedure at the time, 24-hour watches weren't mandatory yet.
So he was just following the rule.
He was. And while the crew on the California did see the distress rockets, their captain, Stanley Lord, misinterpreted them. He thought they were company signals, or maybe a celebration, not a distress call. It was a failure of communication standards and protocols, not just one man's callousness.
Now, the Black Death. The story we all learned in school was definitive. It was rats, and the fleas they carried. Is that foundation of epidemiology still holding up?
It's still the dominant traditional theory, but it's being aggressively challenged by modern epidemiological and paleogenetic research. The core critique is pretty simple. The sheer speed and scale of the 14th century outbreak are really difficult to explain with just the rat flea model.
Why? Why does the rat model struggle to explain the speed?
The rat flea model depends on the ecology of the rat population, which tends to be seasonal and less efficient in cold or rural areas. But the Black Death spread terrifyingly fast across all different climates, including cold northern regions, and it just decimated populations in cities and the countryside almost at the same time.
So what's the alternative theory?
More recent theories suggest that human parasiting fleas and lice, or other human ectoparasites, may have been what drove the infection from person to person.
So you're saying the plague was primarily a human-to-human transmission event, not something mediated by rats?
That's the idea. Human-to-human transmission, through clothing, bedding, direct contact with infected parasites, that would account for the rapid, continuous high mortality spread no matter what the local rodent population was doing. The geographic origin is also shifting, with new evidence pointing away from China and towards specific burial sites near Lake Issyk-Kul in Central Asia as the initial source.
Okay, finally, let's go back to the partition famines. The myth, the one you'd find in the colonial records, was that it was an inevitable tragedy caused by drought or overpopulation.
Right, the narrative of natural inevitability. It's a narrative designed to shift accountability away from the political decision makers. The hard, forensic reality comes from the economics, and specifically from the work of Nobel laureate Amartya Sen. His seminal failure of entitlement approach proved that the famine was entirely policy-driven.
Can you break down that entitlement approach for us?
Sen argued that starvation is rarely caused by a simple lack of food in the world. Instead, it happens when people lose their entitlement to food, their legal ability to command it, or purchase it, or produce it. In Bengal, war inflation, which was caused by British military spending, drove food prices to astronomical levels. At the very same time, that denial policy confiscated the boats and rice stocks of the rural poor, so it stripped them of both their means of income selling rice and their means of purchasing food.
So there might have been food sitting in warehouses in Calcutta, but for the Bengali farmer whose boat was taken away, it was practically on the moon because he had zero ability to buy it.
Precisely. The rice existed, but the system had ensured that millions of people had zero entitlement to it. And this analysis just fundamentally shifted the blame for the famine away from nature and onto policy. Historians like Mathusri Mukherjee have argued that this political calculus, especially with Churchill's refusal to act, meets the definition of a colonial atrocity.
This brings us to this idea of the double-edged sword of catastrophe. They are unbelievably destructive, but they're also unbelievably catalytic.
You see clear strengths. They force immediate reform, like solas after the Titanic, or they spark genuine innovation, like the plague quarantines leading to public health concepts. They create these shared, undeniable reference points that cross cultural lines. But the danger is just as real.
You mean the risk of catastrophe voyeurism?
Yes. Consuming the tragedy as a spectacle, the sinking ship, the erupting volcano, while completely missing the complex, structural, systemic failures that allowed the disaster to get that big in the first place. And the narrative can be weaponized, it can be hijacked for political ends, and there's always the danger of trauma normalization, where societies just get used to living on the edge of the next crisis.
So let's connect all of these profound historical lessons to, right now, these four catastrophes. They really do serve as archetypes for our current global challenges. They're like blueprints for understanding the crises we're facing today.
They are. They're universal blueprints. The warnings are written all over our current landscape, but we often fail to acknowledge them until it's far too late.
Let's start with Pompeii, the illusion of permanence. What's the most immediate modern parallel there?
Oh, the Pompeii archetype is the exact structural parallel to our modern discussions about climate change. You had a prosperous city, a thriving civilization that ignored repeated mounting warning signs for years. Those were the earthquakes. The economic and social cost of actually addressing the tremors seemed too high, so they just normalized the danger until the entire system failed irrevocably.
It's the normalization of extreme weather events.
Right.
We keep ignoring the escalating signs until the system is just completely overwhelmed.
Exactly. Pompeii teaches us that risk blindness isn't ignorance. It's a willful complacency that's rooted in economic prosperity and the comfort of the status quo. And it also defines our cultural obsession with the time capsule, with the idea of sudden, spectacular collapse.
And the Titanic metaphor, I mean, we hear that every day in politics and finance. It seems impossible to escape.
It's ubiquitous. Any CEO or politician presiding over a chaotic, inefficient response to a crisis gets accused of rearranging the deck chairs. But more substantially, the class critique still resonates so profoundly today.
How so?
The idea that during a major crisis, whether it's a pandemic, a climate disaster, a financial crash, that the wealthy and the well-connected will disproportionately get access to the lifeboats.
The healthcare, the bailouts, the safe places to go.
All of it. It's a constant in modern debate. And it reinforces that radical narrative of class injustice that the event first exposed over 100 years ago.
The Black Death, of course, instantly became the historical go-to reference point for the recent global pandemic.
It was the template. The language of the COVID-19 response was entirely framed by the 14th century. We resurrected the word quarantine. We debated the fairness and effectiveness of lockdowns. We struggled with the economic trade-offs between health and GDP. We fought misinformation and political polarization, all of it echoing the social and psychological fractures of 1347.
And it accelerated existing trends.
Massively. It forced the acceleration of trends like remote work and digital governance, just like the plague forced the acceleration of feudalism's collapse.
And the Partition famines. That kind of policy-driven starvation seems to speak directly to the crises we see in today's conflict zones.
It is central to post-colonial studies and modern humanitarian law. The Partition famines are cited in every single analysis of modern conflict-related famines in places like Yemen or South Sudan or Gaza, places where conflict, blockades, and political decisions are the primary causes of mass starvation, not just drought or crop failure. It reiterates that fundamental truth that man-made policy is often the ultimate executioner. It validates Amartya Sen's entitlement approach on a global scale.
So to synthesize all this, let's look at what some of the leading thinkers say about these big patterns. That brings these four very different events together?
Well, we can pull from a few different theoretical fields. Jared Diamond, for instance, his work would argue that disasters expose systemic fragility. They hit the stress fracture points in a civilization's supply chain or its government.
The Titanic's rivets.
Or Bengal's refusal to move food. Those were the stress fractures.
And Yuval Noah Harari's work on social evolution seems to fit perfectly with the Black Death.
Harari would suggest that catastrophe accelerates social evolution. Societies that adapt survive. And the necessity of rebuilding forces centuries of slow, incremental change to happen in just months or years. The Black Death forced Europe to innovate, to move toward capital-intensive farming and industry because labor was suddenly too scarce and valuable to waste. It sped up the birth of the modern economy.
And Michel Foucault's perspective on power is interesting here, especially with quarantine.
Foucault argued that crises allow for new forms of power and control to emerge. In the chaos of a catastrophe, the normal rules get suspended, and that allows new forms of surveillance and governance, like plague quarantines, to take hold. And these new structures, which are designed for an emergency, often become permanent parts of the state's toolkit.
And then, of course, we have Sen's entitlement framework, which we've talked about.
Yeah. It's still seminal. It shifts the blame from external natural forces like a drought to internal systemic failures like policy and inflation. It demonstrates that starvation is a policy failure, not just a failure of nature. And that fundamentally reframes how we have to approach food security globally.
But we should also mention the alternative view from our sources. The argument that focusing too much on the big dramatic disaster can actually hide what's called slow violence.
That's a crucial counterpoint. Critics argue that if we focus exclusively on the spectacular collapse, the volcano, the sinking ship, the sudden plague, we can miss the slow violence that was already happening. The grinding poverty, the ongoing structural colonialism, the endemic inequality. These slower, less visible forces are often the real culprits that made the system so fragile that it shattered in the first place.
Yeah.
These archetypes are only useful if we use them to diagnose both the sudden shock and the underlying chronic disease.
We started this deep dive by saying that human history is written in catastrophe, and I think our analysis has confirmed that profoundly. These four events, the ash, the ice, the bacterium, the empty bowl, they strip humanity down to its core. They ask these critical, timeless questions. Who gets protected? Who is forgotten? What systems fail first when money and life are on the line?
And this raises an important question. These four events, they generated these fundamental myths about the danger of hubris, the fragility of civilization, and the brutal reality of inequality. And their shared legacy is this. They are unparalleled catalysts for deep structural reform.
Whether it's the Solace Treaty after the Titanic, the birth of modern archaeology from Pompeii's ashes, the dismantling of feudalism after the plague, or that deep-seated cultural memory of self-reliance after the famines, every disaster demands a reckoning. The systems that survive are the ones that learn and adapt. The ones that fail are those that give in to risk blindness.
And that brings us to the final and I think most pressing thought. The line between a natural disaster and a man-made one is, well, it's inherently blurry. Vesuvius erupted naturally, but the decision to ignore the tremors for years was human. The iceberg was natural, but the insufficient lifeboats and the failure to communicate were policy. The bacterium was natural, but the starvation in Bengal was deliberate policy.
Right.
We face these looming, predictable global threats today. New pandemics, catastrophic climate change, geopolitical fracturing. So the future question isn't whether disasters will happen, they are inevitable. The question is whether we will finally learn the lessons that are written in the ash and the wreckage without needing another monument to our own failure.
Will we be the architects of our own salvation?
Or will we, through continued policy failure, through denial, and through division, be the authors of our own demise? Will we apply the knowledge from these historical failures to build a more resilient world? That's the real question.
The ash, the ice, the bacterium, the empty bowl. They aren't just relics from the past. They are indeed mirrors. And they're waiting for us to look and to finally act.